Well, I want to welcome you all to the Creating Safer Churches webinar, Domestic Violence in the Black Communities. We are thrilled to have you here. We've been planning this for a long time, and I'm just really thrilled to have you all with us. Keisha's my co-host. She's been with our organization for quite some time, went through our program, is one of our facilitators. She is a biblical life coach. She's an author. She's just an amazing person, and she is over our programs. So she'll be working with us today, and I just want to, Keisha, turn it over to you to turn over to introduce Dr. Chappell, and then Dr. Chappell will start us with prayer, and he'll do one session. We'll do some Q&A. There'll be some interaction, and then we'll do the second session with some interaction, Q&A, and then wrap up at the end. So we'll be going through two different sessions and giving you all some time to ask your questions as well.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. We are excited to have you with us today. And I'm excited to be able to introduce Dr. Chappell. So he is the founder and director of Man Up, a community outreach addressing domestic sexual and gang violence by healing the soul trauma of men and women. He is also the pastor of St. John's All Nations. And so he is out of um, Oregon, and we are so happy to have him with us. So I introduce you all to Dr. Chappell. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Keisha. It is such a pleasure to be here. And Diane, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to be a part of this webinar to have this very, very important conversation. This is something that has been very near and dear to my heart, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that we will have today. But as we get started, let us just start with the word of prayer. So, Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this day because you allowed us to awake this morning with sound minds and bodies, and God, that we can come into this space, that we can engage in this conversation, one that is so needed, that is so important, and that, oh God, that we need so many more people involved in engaging these conversations. We pray that something will be said today that will touch the hearts of those who hear, and God, that they will become ambassadors wherever their sphere of influence touch. God, that they will continue to spread the word. Oh God, and we just ask you right now that you will guide our thoughts, our conversations, and everything that is done and said, that it will bring glory to your holy name. And that we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. And again, thanks again for this great and tremendous opportunity to share in this webinar this morning. When Diane reached out to me, I was delighted because this is something that I've lived pretty much my entire life. And we want to, I like to start out, first of all, um, this is, I want this to be interactive. I want it to be a conversation. I can give you a lot of statistics. I'll give you some. I can give a lot of scriptures. I can give a few of those. But I really want it to be a conversation. And I'd like to share some of my journey, how I got here, and the impact that it has had upon my life. Um, Also, in dealing with this issue, I really want to deal with and speak to the hearts of pastors and faith leaders, especially male faith leaders, because this is something that a lot of us male faith leaders, we either shy away from, we do not engage in, or we will deal with very public situations and not really go in depth. And I've often wondered why is that. But we'll talk about that today. Um, when I look back on my life, the neighborhood that we lived in as a child, there was a lot of violence. I mean, it happened almost every day, but it seemed like our weekends, if it didn't happen during the week, you could almost guarantee something was going to happen on Saturday night. And it was almost like that was our weekend entertainment, is to for violence to break out in the neighborhood on Saturday night. I don't know if it was because of alcoholism or whatever it was,
Mm.
but it seemed like that was something that happened on a consistent basis. Um, the the problem with that is it was so frequent that it become almost normalized, and because of that normalization, it was just kind of either swept under the rug, ignored, or just accepted as a way of life. And as I grew up, one thing that really bothered me is that the violence that happened is, why is that? The things that I saw, I still have very vivid memories of events that occurred, that I witnessed, that still impact my life and my thinking. But as I became a young man, I decided that that was not going to be my story. I wanted to divorce from that. I would not carry that forward. And as I began to um, look more into it, I realized that there was something that was that caused those behaviors. And as an adult, I began to do my own study and trying to come up with answers as to why this was happening and why it was in our community. And it was there, but nobody really was talking about it. It was not being dealt with. And in looking at that, I it took me back to the times of chattel slavery and some of the things that happened during the time of chattel slavery, the violence that took place there. But you're not finding a lot of information. You have to really dig for it to really understand the violence that took place during the time of slavery, with men and women, and the type of abuse that happened during those events for 400 years. 400 years of abuse that took place on the plantation. A lot of that, you find that because it was not really studied, it was not really reported on. A lot of it, and what was found, a lot of it was sanitized. But in thinking about some of the abuse that I witnessed as a child and even as an adult that I saw, I had to question, where did it come from? And a lot of it, I recognized that it was learned during the time of slavery. And the one thing that we understand is that during that time, and what we're talking about today is in the Black community. And I realize violence takes place in all communities, but today we're really focused on the African American community in this country. Um, and the violence that took place, oftentimes as a child, and I think a lot of you will relate to this. Um, when I was growing up, we would have they would call whippings, and we would have to go out and get our own switch, and I think some of you probably can relate to that. There was the time that we faced the belt, um, or the extension cord. Oh yeah, that extension cord. What about the razor strap? These are practices that came out of slavery, with the beatings to discipline people, to force them, to make them submit to the master. Um, but because they were learned during that time, they were carried forth into our today's environment. And some of you, um, I'm sure that you have experienced those, especially those of us who are more in the senior age. And some of you, you might want to just put some of the things in the chat that you experience. But the one thing that I recognize is the whippings, and sometimes they weren't called whippings, they were called whoopings, okay, or beatings. These were terminologies that were used a lot in my growing up. I heard a lot of that type of terminology. Um, Another thing that I heard uh, is that um, my father, oftentimes when he would threaten me or threaten anyone, he would use the terminology, "Boy, I will skin you alive," or "I will tan your hide." I always question what was that. What was he really saying? Well, tan hide, that's an animal type of reference. Skin you alive, that is an animal type of reference. That is um, a form of verbal abuse. And so when we hear these types of this type of language, it tends to cause us to um, it causes us to really stop and think about where all of this came from and how we got to this place. And fast forward to that, I was uh, a pastor in Wyoming, and in the pastorate, I had a family that the husband was very abusive, and I would talk to the wife, and the wife would share some of the experiences. But the one thing that I really begin to understand is that the conversation that we had, I would deal with that, but I was only dealing with the issues, the circumstances that became very public. There were other situations that, because they were more covert and not overt situations, they were not recognized or ignored or not really addressed. And so um, I I would deal with that. Um, and I find also that as I talk with other pastors about domestic violence in our community, that oftentimes they were not really engaged in the subject of domestic violence because of the abuse maybe that they had experienced, and oftentimes because it had become normalized, we just accept it as a way of life, and that's the danger part of it. But we have people who are experiencing that, and I think that oftentimes people in our churches, in our congregations, in our families who are experiencing that when they come and they may use terminology. I think we need to really start paying attention to the words that people use um, and think about that what they're telling us. They're trying to get a message to us that something is happening, but we're not really listening. We're not watching. We're not paying attention. Um, and so when I look at some of the statistics, some of the statistics that we have is that just if we look at in 2022, there were over 2,400 women that were murdered by their offender, which happened to be a male offender. Oftentimes, we talk about domestic violence, it has to do with men. Yes, there are women, but the most of the abusers are men. There were over 2,400 murders just in 2022. 58% of those were wives or girlfriends or someone who were associated with that person. Um, and the crazy thing about domestic violence is that it is not the person who is a stranger. Violence usually happens against someone who is close in relationship, live in the same house. The ones who should be experiencing love are the ones who experiences the violence. And and I've often wondered, why is that? Instead of it being a stranger, it's always the person who should be the one who is experiencing, or should be the one recipient of love. But when we also look in the African American community, in the African American community, 45% of Black women, that's almost half, every 1 in 2 Black women have experienced stalking or some type of physical, sexual, or verbal abuse in their lifetime. That is something that, again, because it seems to have been normalized, we don't pay attention to the signs. We really need to stop and take inventory of the signs that are there. 40% of the Black women will experience domestic violence throughout the course of their lifetime, as compared to 30% of white women. But the other part of that is, 58, about 53% of Black women have experienced psychological abuse. That's the other part of abuse. It's not so much the physical. Well, yes, that happens, but also there are the verbal abuse, the financial abuse, other types of abuse, um, and even to the point of homicide, where they are actually murdered. This family that I mentioned, I really had concerns about the husband murdering either the wife or the children or the animals in the house to maintain control. That was always a concern. And so I always, instead of pushing him away, I wanted to have a relationship with him. I drew him in and let him know that I was watching, that I was aware, that I was looking, and that I was not going to sit by and be passive and allow him to continue to abuse. And because of that, I think that a lot of the violence that he would have committed against his family was avoided because because of my presence and my conversation with him, letting him know I'm not going to sit by and just let this happen. And so my involvement in his life, I believe, really saved that family. Um, and that really taught me a lesson, um, over the course of my ministry. Another thing that happened, um, and that got me involved with this is I was, as I was pastoring, people would come to my church, women, and they would give signs. They would say, um, give clues that they were looking for help. But because I was not aware, I missed the signs. And because of missing the signs, they would come, they would enjoy our services, they would sit in our midst and enjoy the fellowship, put out the signs. We missed those, then they would go right back home to their violent situations. And that was something that once I became aware of that, it really broke my heart. And I realized that I needed to do something about that. Um, when I was in Wyoming and pastored there, I was a part of the chaplains corps throughout the state of Wyoming. We developed a chaplains corps, throughout the state from the different cities and counties. I think at one time, we had about 58 chaplains from the state of Wyoming. Every year, we would go to the Law Enforcement Academy for a week-long conference. And in that conference, we would have seminars and workshops, just for the chaplains who were there. In one of the conferences, we had a presenter that dealt with domestic violence, and he began to talk about the cycle of violence, what that looked like, um, with the honeymoon period, where the violence begins to be escalated. It gets to a point where the violence, the perpetration happens. Then after the cycle of violence, then It moved in from the violence began to de-escalate to what they call the honeymoon period or the rose period, um, where the gifts would come instead of an apology. There would be that, and when I went to that and I saw that, it opened my eyes to what I was actually seeing in my church, because I was seeing that cycle and I thought, wow, this is textbook stuff. And then as I got more involved in the advocacy against domestic and sexual violence, I was introduced to the power and control wheel. And that is something that I think that every pastor, every faith leader really should have um, a reference to, because they will be able to see the cycle that takes place in domestic violence. The perpetrators, for some reason, I don't know how it's learned, but they follow a certain pattern. And when we have educated ourselves, we can get to a point that we begin to recognize and identify those patterns. Um, One thing that really got me involved, and I'll talk about it in our next session, but that really got me involved is I was invited to a conference in Portland, and it was a 1 day conference. About maybe 400 or 500 people in this conference at the convention center, and they would ask questions about to do a room survey of who was representing what environment, what organization, what type of um, background that they come from. And when they came and asked the question for the faith community, who's here from the faith community? I was appalled because only one hand went up, and that was myself. And I began to look around and I said, there's something terribly wrong with this. How come there's not more faith people here representing the faith community in a conference like this? And I really heard the Holy Spirit speak to me and unction in me. Why do you think you're here? Um, and so I had been involved with domestic violence pretty much all my life, on seeing it, experiencing it, knowing what it looked like, but not really being educated to and being sensitized to what was going on. Like I said, it had become something that was normalized. And so I just did not recognize the signs. And so in out of that conference, I began to uh, become engaged, got involved with the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. Um, that was really helped uh, get me some experience, got me some training. I began to recognize signs, recognize that domestic violence is not just physical, it's sexual, it's financial, it's relationship. I mean, it's verbal abuse, all of that. And so I went back and began to think back over my life, even as my time in the service. Um, the verbiage that people use, that when guys get together, they'll begin to talk about women and utilize their body parts, talk about their body parts in a very degrading way. We won't even go there today, talk about name any of those, but I think we all have heard that terminology used um, to make reference to women. And again, what is that doing? It is a form of dehumanizing our women. And when we normalize violence, when we dehumanize our women, we're not respecting them. We see them as objects. All of that plays into the violence. And at some point, it has to be stopped. We have to really stop and recognize that somebody has to stand up, speak up, and say, this is not right. And that's where um, we are today. And I believe that How I got here basically is a journey through my life. And I'll in the next segment we'll talk about what the church can do. But
Mm.
I will hold up here because we do have some time for some Q&A. Some of you have some thoughts um, and or some questions. We'd like to take a few of those at this time, and I'm going to give it to Keisha that she can um, facilitate this portion of the conversation. And so at this time, Keisha, if you want to go ahead and do that at this time, I will step aside and I'll be here to answer any questions that you have.
Sure. We do have a few comments and questions in the chat. A comment from Samaria: public whoopings of children if they misbehave during class at school. And I think you kind of touched on that. Mm-hmm. Let's see here. Deborah Ogletree: were the women Black? I think you kind of touched on that as well. Do you have an age category? And I'm assuming that is for the domestic abuse, any certain ages.
That
You
was,
want to
yeah, that was
talk
during the
about that?
statistics time, right? Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one thing that we're finding is that, and there's not a lot of statistics, but it's there's becoming more and more of it. And adolescent girls are becoming
Mm-hmm.
targets, teenagers of domestic violence by their boyfriends or their significant others. Um, that's becoming more and more of a problem. And again, I think it's because of the language that's being used, the practices that's being passed on, and um, it's not being dealt with, it's not being addressed.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's allowed to continue to perpetrate and propagate in among our society. And it has to be stopped. But yes, that's one that's really starting to become a problem. Yes, um, women, middle age, young 20s, 30s, 40s. That's the age that a lot of the violence takes place during those ages. That age group.
Dr. Chappell, in our group, I can also speak to, yes, it's adult, like 18 and up is typically the statistic age range when they give those. But I will tell you, I know in our culture, I'm sure other cultures, that dating violence, dating abuse, it's just no different. It's really no different. And if we don't catch our youth, they're just going to take that into their
Yes,
marriages, especially if
yes.
they come out of a home where they see it. It does feel normal. That's
Right.
just they don't even see the red signs, the women
Mm-hmm.
or the
Mm-hmm.
men.
That's
I
what's exciting.
totally agree with you.
And I too would like to make a comment. This is so very interesting. I appreciate you being here doing this, commenting upon the violence. Now, here we are, there's women. I also had an abuse conference addressing abuse in the church. And the one thing that I noticed, because I am a pastor, and one thing that I noticed, the women, I didn't have any problems recruiting women
Mm-hmm.
to events such as this, but the men were not supportive at all. Not even men in my own church, men that I know who, because I'm part of a clergy group, and not a one was, I mean, they were supporting by mouth. Okay, Pastor Ogletree, what you're doing is a good thing. It's needed, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't show up. So,
Right.
what is your thoughts on why is it that because we're talking about abuse, especially within the Black community,
Mm-hmm.
that it's even difficult to get men from the Black church who
Mm-hmm.
has daughters and wives and granddaughters, but they will not support anything like this?
Mm-hmm.
Can you address that?
I sure can. One thing that when I started getting involved with dealing with domestic violence, trying to put the spotlight on this problem and this issue in our churches, in our communities, um, I I tried to get other pastors engaged, and I use the expression, it went over like a lead balloon. They were not engaged, and one thing that I began to recognize, because now my eyes have become open, I'm beginning to recognize and see signs. I see what is happening in our community, because now it's not normalized anymore. I'm real sensitized to it. When I talk to pastors and I begin to see some of them, a lot of them are abusive, and I hate to say that, um, but they have those abusive tendencies where women are objectified. I'm not saying all, but too many are objectify women. They put women in a position, in a class. They don't recognize women as peers, even like you're saying as a pastor. Um, there will be some who recognizes you as a pastor. Others probably will not recognize that. And some of the pastors' wives, the way that they're treated, the position that they're put in, um, are degrading. And that's why it's so important that we speak up. Another thing is, like I was saying, is that um, a lot of the abuse in the African American community was learned, and that those these behaviors being learned, they
Mhm.
are practices that are carried forth from generation to generation. One thing that in the book by Paulo Freire, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, one thing he said, and I'll paraphrase, he said that the oppressor oppresses, and when the oppressed learn the habits of the oppressor, then the oppressed becomes now the oppressor, because the oppressed sees oppression as a form of liberation. And
Mm,
when I look at that and I think about that, that is something that until we begin to address it, talk about it, not be silent about it, it's going to continue on. And that's why this conversation is so important, because
mhm,
the more we talk about it, and I have to applaud the women. I've gone to many conferences like this, and women are there. There are times that I've had men's meetings, and the men, when the women are not there, men will speak up. But when women are there, men usually will not say anything. They'll sit back and be silent. And we've got to change that. And like I was saying earlier in my introduction, I really want to speak to the heart of faith leaders, especially male faith leaders. And if I can reach one, that's huge. But the more men that we're able to reach with this topic, I think our communities will be better off. But I thank you for raising that question, because it's a very important question.
Herman, do you want to take yourself off of mute and ask your question?
Okay, thank you very much. Pastor Cliff, thank you for doing this. Uh,
Yes, sir.
there are so many components of this I identify with. Being the ninth child of a mother who had been married twice to military men, and my dad didn't marry her. Um, but being a product of a military father who didn't have the privilege of him living with us, there was a lot of words that I heard in our house from military people who had been abused even in the military.
Mm.
And they brought it home with them. And they began to use it on children in the neighborhood in North and Northeast Portland. Now, I was born in 1959, so this goes way back, because now I'm 66 years young. And I just want to say, when I became a pastor, I went all over the country out of Portland, and I got to California, and I learned a word from the Hispanic community that I thought in the Black community, we borrowed that word too, called machismo. And it was a term that became, as Pastor Cliff said, very obvious to me that we had a lady show up for church, similar to the churches Cliff described in Wyoming that he served in. Um, there was a lady who came to me, I think 3 times before I recognized the bruises on her face.
Mm, mm,
And then I recognized bruises on the kids. And the husband never came. And so I went home with him one day after church and I confronted him, a little gregarious, I might say. But I found that God did some turnaround on him. And he later was baptized and he became a leader in our church. But I knew because of my home upbringing, I had watched my sisters be abused by men outside our home. And it helped me to be a compassionate man to situations like this. So I want to say on behalf of men, sometimes we have learned behavior Pastor Cliff told us about. And to tattle on ourselves or another man is not always too much machismo, but it's very against God to allow sin of abuse to go on. And I just want to put that out there. Thank you so much, Cliff, for doing this. Uh-huh.
Certainly welcome.
Thank you for your comments.
I have
As,
I
as
have a
you were,
go ahead. Okay. Um, I think about the women in my family. Growing up, I know that with my children, abuse was not seen or was not active in homes, and I think um, in other my siblings' lives was not seen, but ended up being. It's like a lot of the women in my family have been victims of domestic violence. So can you kind of talk about how it was not seen, but they ended up in situations like that?
Yes, and and again, I think it was seen, but it was not recognized. One thing that I found, like I was saying, the violence was there, but because it was so normalized, we didn't even recognize it. It was just normal. Um, and I think I think sometimes we think of abuse as um, physical. It may not be physical. That old saying that sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Anybody ever heard that? One thing that I learned in growing up is that words have very deep meanings. You can say things that
mhm,
are abusive. Um, I've seen families where the perpetrator would call on the job of the victim or the survivor and would say things that would cause problems on a person's job, um, or isolate them from their friends and family, keep them so that they would not have an outlet or have relationships with others. That's a form of abuse, where they're not allowed to be open or associate. They'll try to separate them from other support system, from the families, from friends, to keep them from talking. They want all of the control in that person's life. And these are things that we often uh, don't attribute to domestic violence, but they're very
oh,
real. Or the abuse could be, okay, if you do this, if you don't do that, I'm going to harm your cat. I'm going to hurt your dog. I'll take your toys. I'll do such and such a thing. Um, these are all forms of abuse, and because we just accept it, oftentimes we don't recognize it as what it is. But once I begin to get involved, I begin to recognize these different signs, and uh, they became very, very real and very alive to me. And so I think sometimes, or what we need to do is we need to have these conversations more often, because as we go forward, having these conversations, we're going to begin to recognize there are signs. Some of them very subtle, some of them are very overt. But if we don't recognize them, we will miss them. And that's where I was at one time. I was missing many of the signs because I was just ignorant to it or numb to it.
Thank you,
I was
Dr.
not
Chappell.
sensitive. Yes.
We have a question from Dr. Gray and a few comments from Carla. And what we can do for you, those of you who are attending, is we had done a webinar on red flags. So we will send that to you. We're going to send you a series of emails, but we'll be sure to include that with you that you can share with others as well. So Dr. Gray, if you want to take yourself off of mute and ask your question. We just have a few minutes before we need to get into the second session. We're actually a little bit over time, but let's just try to make these quick so Dr. Chappell can do the second session of his talk.
I just want to say I thank God for this forum that you're having. I also have a ministry in regards to church and the and domestic violence. I'm a survivor myself, well, conqueror. What I'm trying to understand is the way we might be able to have a men's only DV session. Maybe they will talk about it, because there are men who are abused, men who are the abuser, but they may be more comfortable in a man's only forum where they may speak about it. How would you suggest we put something like that together? I do a symposium every year, open for everybody, but as it was stated, we don't have so much male buy-in. How would you suggest that?
See this on my shirt? Man
Yes.
Up.
Uh-huh.
That's a program that I developed for that very purpose, that reason. And I'll be talking about that here as we get closer to the end of our session today.